For 18 days, Iran operated under the assumption that losing the Strait of Hormuz was the worst case scenario. They were wrong. On April 29, 2026, during a press briefing that received surprisingly little media attention, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz outlined what he called Phase 2 of the administration's Iran strategy. The language was diplomatic. The implications were not. Let that sink in. According to three separate sources speaking to Reuters, The Wall Street Journal, and Politico, the Trump administration is not treating the neutralization of Iran's Hormuz threat as the end of an operation. They are treating it as the beginning of a comprehensive dismantlement campaign designed to eliminate Iran's ability to project power beyond its borders for a generation. We are not talking about sanctions. We are not talking about negotiated limitations. We are talking about what defense policy analysts quoted by Defense News are calling the most aggressive peacetime pressure campaign directed at a nation-state since the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And the initial evidence suggests this is not rhetoric. It is operational planning already in motion. But here is what almost no one is explaining, and it changes the entire strategic picture. This is not just about Iran. This is about sending a message to Beijing, Moscow, and Pyongyang about what happens when you challenge U.S. red lines in 2026. Let us walk through exactly what Trump's next move appears to be, why it is structured the way it is, and what it means for Iran, the Middle East, and global power competition over the next 5 years. Start with what just became possible, because strategy is about sequencing, and the Hormuz operation unlocked options that did not exist 3 weeks ago. Before April 17th, when U.S. Central Command declared the Strait of Hormuz open under American security guarantees, Iran still possessed escalation dominance in one critical area. If the U.S. or its regional partners pushed too hard, Tehran could threaten to close the waterway that carries 21% of the world's oil. That threat imposed a ceiling on how much pressure Washington could apply. It created operational caution. It forced risk calculations that favored restraint. That ceiling no longer exists. According to reporting from Bloomberg and the Washington Post, citing officials familiar with National Security Council deliberations, the Trump administration views the current moment as what one official called a 90-day window of maximum leverage before Iran adapts or the international coalition fractures. That timeline is critical. It tells you this is not a long-term containment strategy. This is a blitz designed to accomplish in 3 months what 4 decades of intermittent pressure could not. So what does Phase 2 actually look like? Based on public statements, background briefings reported by multiple outlets, and operational indicators, the campaign has 4 distinct components. Component 1, complete financial isolation. Component 2, infrastructure degradation. Component 3, proxy network rollback. Component 4, and this is the piece getting almost no attention, permanent reshaping of the regional security architecture to prevent reconstitution. Let us take these in order. Financial isolation first. On April 23rd, the U.S. Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC, announced what it described as enhanced secondary sanctions targeting any financial institution anywhere in the world that processes transactions linked to Iranian oil sales, even indirectly. According to analysis from the Atlantic Council's Econofact initiative, this goes significantly beyond previous sanctions regimes. Under the previous framework, international banks face penalties for directly financing Iranian oil trades. Under the new framework, they face penalties for handling currency flows that originated from Iranian sales, even if those flows have been laundered through multiple intermediaries. Think about what that means in practice. A Chinese bank that accepts payment from a Malaysian trading company that bought oil from a third-party broker who sourced crude from Iran now faces potential exclusion from the U.S. financial system. That is not a sanction on Iran. That is a forced choice imposed on every bank in the global financial system. Do business with Iran or do business with the dollar-denominated world. You cannot do both. According to data from the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, or SWIFT, cited by Reuters, 88% of international transactions are denominated in or settled through U.S. dollars. Exclusion from that system is functionally equivalent to exclusion from the global economy. The impact has been immediate. Between April 23rd and April 28th, according to shipping data compiled by Capeler and Tanker Trackers, at least 9 vessels carrying Iranian crude were refused port entry in China and Malaysia after banks refused to process payment guarantees. The oil is sitting on ships with nowhere to go. Now, component two, infrastructure degradation. This is the part that most analysis is misunderstanding. On April 26th, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, during a Foreign Affairs Committee hearing reported by CNN and C-SPAN, stated that the United States would support all necessary measures to ensure Iran cannot reconstitute offensive capabilities that threaten freedom of navigation. That phrase, all necessary measures, is doing enormous diplomatic work. It is deliberately vague enough to encompass kinetic strikes, cyber operations, sabotage, or support for third-party actions. And the early indicators suggest all of those are in play. According to reporting from the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, citing intelligence officials speaking on background, the United States has provided Israel with updated targeting intelligence on Iranian missile production facilities, uranium enrichment infrastructure, and Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps command nodes. This is not old intelligence. This is current actionable targeting data. On April 27th, explosions were reported at a facility near Parchin, southeast of Tehran, that the Institute for Science and International Security has previously identified as linked to missile development. Iranian state media attributed the incident to an industrial accident. But satellite imagery analyzed by Maxar Technologies and reported by Reuters shows blast patterns consistent with precision munitions, not accidental detonations. No one has claimed responsibility. No one needs to. The message is clear. Iran's military-industrial infrastructure is now targetable, and the protective umbrella that the Hormuz threat once provided is gone. Then there is the cyber dimension. According to sources quoted by Wired Magazine and Cyberscoop, U.S. Cyber Command has been authorized to conduct persistent engagement operations against Iranian command and control networks, financial systems, and oil infrastructure supervisory control and data acquisition systems known as SCADA. Persistent engagement is a doctrinal term. It means continuous low-level cyber operations designed to degrade, disrupt, and impose costs rather than one-time penetrations. We are talking about injecting errors into refinery control systems, corrupting financial transaction databases, degrading air defense radar calibration. Death by 1,000 digital cuts. The Iranian government has not publicly confirmed most of these intrusions, which is itself telling. Acknowledging the scope of penetration would be admitting a level of vulnerability that undermines domestic legitimacy. Now, component three, proxy network rollback. This is where the strategy moves beyond Iran itself and into the regional chessboard. According to reporting from Al Jazeera, Military Times, and the Associated Press, U.S. Special Operations Forces and intelligence assets have significantly increased support to Kurdish groups operating in northwestern Iran, Baloch separatists in the southeast, and Arab militias in Khuzestan, Iran's oil-rich southwestern province. We are not talking about diplomatic support. We are talking about weapons, training, intelligence, and operational coordination. On April 24th, explosions damaged a section of pipeline infrastructure near Avaz in Khuzestan. A previously unknown group calling itself the Avaz Liberation Front claimed responsibility. According to analysis from the Critical Threats Project at the American Enterprise Institute, the sophistication of the attack, specifically the targeting of a pipeline segment that maximizes disruption while minimizing civilian casualties, suggests external training and intelligence support. Simultaneously, according to reports from Reuters and the Times of Israel, the United States has provided Saudi Arabia and the UAE with intelligence and targeting support for operations against Houthi positions in Yemen, effectively enabling a renewed pressure campaign against Iran's most effective regional proxy. The goal, according to former U.S. Central Command officials quoted by Breaking Defense, is to force Iran into a multi-front defensive posture where Tehran is reacting to crises rather than initiating them. But component 4 is the piece that elevates this from a pressure campaign to a structural realignment. On April 28th, during a visit to Riyadh, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth announced the framework for what he called a Middle East Strategic Security Initiative. According to details reported by Defense News and Jane's Defense Weekly, the initiative would formalize a multilateral defense architecture linking the United States, Israel, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, and potentially Jordan and Egypt in a coordinated air defense, intelligence sharing, and rapid response network. This is not a treaty. Treaties require Senate ratification, and the Trump administration is reportedly structuring this as an executive agreement to avoid that requirement. But the practical effect is the creation of a NATO-like structure specifically designed to contain Iran. The centerpiece, according to sources quoted by Bloomberg and Axios, is an integrated air and missile defense system that would link radars, interceptors, and command networks across all participating nations, creating a shield that could intercept Iranian ballistic missiles, drones, or aircraft anywhere in the region within minutes of launch detection. Think about what that means for Iran strategically. Tehran's remaining conventional military leverage rests primarily on its ballistic missile arsenal, estimated by the Center for Strategic and International Studies at more than 3,000 missiles of various ranges. But missiles are only effective if they can reach their targets. If the U.S. and its regional partners create an integrated defense network that can intercept a significant percentage of Iran's missile force, that leverage evaporates, just like the Hormuz threat did. Iran is being systematically stripped of every tool it has used to project power and deter adversaries for 40 years. However, and this is where responsible analysis requires us to present the other side, not every expert believes this strategy will work, or that it will work without catastrophic unintended consequences. Dr. Suzanne Maloney, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and former State Department policy advisor, argued in an April 26th analysis that maximum pressure campaigns have a mixed historical record at best. She pointed to the 2018 to 2020 maximum pressure campaign under Trump's first term, which succeeded in cratering Iran's economy but failed to change Tehran's behavior on nuclear development or regional activities. In fact, Maloney noted, Iran's uranium enrichment levels increased during that period, and its support for proxies in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen intensified. The argument, essentially, is that pressure without a viable off-ramp does not produce capitulation. It produces desperation. And desperate regimes with nothing left to lose make dangerous decisions. Trita Parsi, executive vice president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, went further in comments to Al Jazeera on April 27th, arguing that the current strategy is designed to produce regime collapse, not behavior change. And regime collapse in a nation of 88 million people with significant ethnic and sectarian divisions, he warned, could produce chaos that makes the Syrian civil war look manageable by comparison. There is also the China factor. According to reporting from the South China Morning Post and Nikkei Asia, Beijing has watched the Hormuz operation and the subsequent pressure campaign with deep concern, not because China has any particular affection for the Iranian regime, but because the demonstration of U.S. capability to neutralize a regional power and reshape security architecture around its exclusion is a preview of what Washington might attempt in the Taiwan Strait or the South China Sea. On April 25th, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Wang Wenbin stated that Beijing opposes unilateral coercion and supports the legitimate security interests of all nations. That is diplomatic language, but the subtext is clear. China is signaling it may provide Iran with economic or diplomatic support, not to save Tehran, but to demonstrate that U.S. pressure campaigns have limits and costs. So the counterargument is substantive. Maximum pressure might corner Iran into accelerating its nuclear program. It might produce internal collapse that creates a failed state. It might drive deeper Chinese-Iranian alignment that complicates U.S. strategy globally. All of those risks are real. The question is whether the Trump administration has calculated that those risks are preferable to the status quo of managed containment that has characterized U.S.-Iran policy for decades. Now let us talk about what this means for you. Because when the United States restructures the security architecture of a region that supplies 30% of global oil, the effects travel. In the immediate term, the continued pressure on Iran is keeping oil prices elevated. According to data from the International Energy Agency and Bloomberg Energy, Brent crude is currently trading around $104 per barrel as of late April. That is down from the crisis peak of $132, but it is still 27% higher than pre-crisis levels. Every dollar increase in crude oil translates to approximately 2.4 cents per gallon at the pump, according to the American Automobile Association. At current levels, the average U.S. household is spending roughly $65 more per month on gasoline than in February. Over a year, that is $780 in additional costs. But the longer-term implication is more complex. If the Trump administration succeeds in permanently neutralizing Iran as a disruptive force in Gulf energy markets, the result could actually be long-term price stability at lower levels. Oil markets hate uncertainty. The risk premium built into every barrel of Gulf crude is partly insurance against the possibility of Iranian disruption. Remove that risk permanently, and prices could structurally decline. However, if the strategy backfires, if it drives internal collapse in Iran or triggers broader regional conflict, the price spike could dwarf what we saw in March. Energy analysts at Rapidan Energy Group estimate that a complete breakdown of order in Iran could remove 2 to 3 million barrels per day from global markets for an extended period, potentially driving Brent crude above $150 per barrel. There is also the geopolitical stability question. According to analysis from Eurasia Group and Stratfor, the current pressure campaign is being closely watched by every nation that has ever considered challenging U.S. interests. North Korea is watching. Russia is watching. Venezuela is watching. If Iran capitulates, the message is clear. Challenging the United States leads to comprehensive dismantlement. But if Iran survives, or if the campaign produces chaos that ultimately costs the U.S. more than it gains, the message is equally clear. American power has limits, and resistance can succeed. The outcome of the next 90 days does not just determine Iran's future. It sets the template for great power competition for the rest of the decade. Then there is the nuclear dimension, the piece that keeps strategic planners awake at night. According to the most recent International Atomic Energy Agency report from March 2026, Iran's stockpile of uranium enriched to 60% purity, just below the 90% threshold considered weapons grade, stood at approximately 142 kilograms. According to nuclear weapons experts cited by the Arms Control Association, 40 kilograms is sufficient for one nuclear weapon if further enriched. Iran currently has enough material for 3 weapons if it makes that decision. Every pressure campaign analyst must answer one question. Does this strategy make an Iranian nuclear breakout more or less likely? The Trump administration's apparent bet is that by removing Iran's conventional options, Tehran will be forced to negotiate from a position of weakness. The counter-bet is that Iran, facing existential pressure, will sprint for a weapon as the only remaining deterrent. History does not provide a clear answer. Libya gave up its nuclear program under pressure in 2003, and Muammar Gaddafi was dead 8 years later. North Korea accelerated its program under pressure, and the Kim regime survives today. Which path Iran takes may depend less on U.S. strategy and more on internal regime calculations we cannot see. So here's what we do not know. We do not know whether the 90-day window framing represents an actual operational timeline or simply urgency rhetoric designed to maintain coalition cohesion. We do not know whether Iran's leadership will interpret the current pressure as an existential threat requiring nuclear breakout or as a temporary crisis to be endured. We do not know whether China will limit its support for Iran to diplomatic statements or escalate to economic and potentially military assistance to demonstrate resistance to U.S. pressure campaigns. We do not know whether the regional security architecture being built, this Middle East Strategic Security Initiative, will hold together under pressure or fracture along the traditional fault lines of Arab-Israeli tensions and Sunni-Shia rivalries. And we do not know what happens inside Iran if the regime does collapse. Who fills the vacuum? How do you manage the transition in a heavily armed nation with ballistic missiles and nuclear material? What we do know is that 3 scenarios are on the table. Scenario 1, successful capitulation. Iran, facing comprehensive pressure with no remaining leverage, enters negotiations and accepts stringent limits on its nuclear program, ballistic missile development, and regional proxy support in exchange for sanctions relief and normalization. This is the administration's stated goal. Scenario 2, nuclear breakout. Iran decides its only path to survival is a crash program to produce nuclear weapons as rapidly as possible, calculating that once it has a deterrent, the pressure campaign becomes untenable. This triggers either military strikes or acceptance of a nuclear Iran. Scenario 3, managed collapse. The regime does not fully fall, but fragments. Portions of the country fall under militia control. Oil production craters. The region descends into a multi-year stabilization crisis that requires sustained U.S. military presence and nation-building efforts, the very outcome multiple administrations have tried to avoid. None of these scenarios returns Iran to its pre-March 2026 position. That world is gone. Iran lost its last card when it lost Hormuz. What comes next depends on decisions being made in Tehran, Washington, Beijing, and Riyadh right now. And the consequences of those decisions will ripple through energy markets, military planning, and global power structures for a generation. The next 90 days will tell us whether the Trump administration's brutal next move produces the strategic realignment it is designed to achieve, or a crisis that spirals beyond anyone's control. If this breakdown gave you a clearer picture of what is actually at stake in the US-Iran confrontation and why the next 3 months might determine the Middle East's trajectory for the next decade, subscribe and turn on notifications. Because this story is moving faster than the news cycle can process, and the next inflection point could happen within days.